Okay, let's dive in. Picture this. Someone's in the ICU. The situation is, well, obviously critical. Now, here's something that might surprise you. Nearly half of these patients, almost half, have lower than normal levels of ionized calcium in their blood. But here's where it gets really interesting. There's been this ongoing debate among doctors. Does this common calcium dip actually make things worse for the patient?
Yeah, it's a real puzzle. Some studies seem to show a link, others not so much, especially after you account for everything else going on.
Exactly. It's this uncertainty that's fascinating. We see low ionized calcium all the time in critically ill people,
Right.
but actually pinning down its direct effect on, survival,
Mm-hmm.
that's been tough. It gets tangled up with all the other serious problems these patients face.
It really does.
So for this deep dive, our mission is pretty straightforward. We're looking at a brand new study that tries to clear this up. It's a clinical investigation just published this year, 2025, in Critical Care Medicine. The title is Association of Hypocalcemia and Mean Arterial Pressure with Patient Outcome in ICU.
Quite a title.
Yeah, tells you what it's about, though. And importantly, this wasn't some small look. They analyzed data from almost 5,000 patients
Well,
over a decade.
wow, okay. Nearly 5,000 over 10 years. That's substantial data.
It is. And you can see right away why this matters, right?
Yeah.
For anyone listening who wants to get the finer points of critical care, maybe you work in healthcare, maybe you're just curious about how the body copes under extreme stress.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing what really impacts survival is crucial. This could be a shortcut to understanding a pretty complex bit of patient care.
I think that's a good way to put it. It helps cut through some of the noise.
Yeah, we want to get past the jargon and focus on what matters. So today, we're really zeroing in on two core questions.
Okay, what are they?
First, what is the relationship between low ionized calcium, they call IK, in that first 24 hours in the ICU, and a patient's chances of survival?
Right, the core question.
And second, could something seemingly different, like their blood pressure, actually be playing a role in that relationship? Is there a connection there?
Okay. So not just if calcium matters, but potentially how it matters, maybe through blood pressure.
Exactly. Which brings up, how do they even study this? What kind of research are we talking about?
Right, good point. It's important to know this was a retrospective observational study.
Meaning they looked back at existing data.
Precisely. They looked back at records already collected from adult patients admitted to the ICUs at a general hospital. They weren't intervening, just observing what had happened.
Okay. And the scale, again, almost 5,000 adults admitted between, 2013 and 2022.
That's right. And specifically patients who didn't already have high calcium when they came in.
Got it. So what jumped out right away from that huge data set?
Well, one of the first really striking things was just how common the low calcium was.
Yeah, you said nearly half earlier.
It was 43.7% to be exact. Had low ionized calcium below 1.1 millimoles per liter within that first day in the ICU.
Wow. Almost every other patient. And did they look at how those patients fared compared to the ones with normal calcium?
They did, and the difference was, well, pretty stark.
Okay.
The ICU mortality rate for the group with low ionized calcium was 19.1%.
Oof, nearly 1 in 5.
Yeah. Compare that to the group with normal calcium levels, their mortality rate was only 4.7%.
Huge difference.
Massive. And just for context, the median age for everyone was 61, slightly more women than men, about 57%. Gives you a picture of the typical patient in this study.
So right off the bat, just looking at the raw numbers, it screams. Low calcium in that first day looks like a major red flag.
It certainly suggests that, yes.
But okay, as we said, critically ill patients have a lot going on. How did they try to isolate calcium? To see if it was a risk factor on its own, not just a marker of someone being generally sicker.
That's the crucial next step. They used what's called multivariate analysis.
Statistical wizardry.
Sort of. It's basically using statistical tools to adjust for or control for a whole bunch of other factors that could also influence survival.
Like what kind of factors?
Things like the patient's age, how sick they were according to standard scoring systems you might have heard of, SOFA or Apache 2 scores.
Yeah, measures of organ dysfunction and overall illness severity.
Exactly. Plus things like albumin levels, other important lab results. They tried to account for all those potential confounders.
Okay, so they factored all that in. And after crunching those numbers, what do they find specifically about the calcium level?
Even after adjusting for all those other variables, low ionized calcium in the first 24 hours was still independently associated with higher ICU mortality.
Yes, significant.
Still significant. They reported an odds ratio of 0.17 with a p-value less than 0.05, which in statistics means it's unlikely this result is just due to chance.
Okay, an odds ratio of 0.17. Let's try and make that a bit more tangible. What does that number actually mean in terms of impact?
So the way to interpret that specific odds ratio is actually that higher calcium was protective. For every zero point 0.1 unit increase in ionized calcium,
Oh, okay.
the odds of dying in the ICU decreased by about 8%.
Gotcha. So conversely, lower calcium means higher odds of mortality. Even a small dip seems to matter quite a bit.
It certainly appears that way based on this analysis. It really emphasizes that those early calcium levels might be quite significant for a patient's chances.
And thinking back to that debate we mentioned at the start, some studies showing a link, some not, how does this finding fit in?
That's a really important point. The researchers themselves pointed this out. While some previous work did suggest this link, other studies didn't find it once they adjusted for all those other factors.
Right.
So this study, by carefully controlling for variables like illness severity, age, and lab values, adds, I think, stronger evidence to the argument that early hypocalcemia really is an independent risk factor in this population.
Okay, so the picture's getting clearer. Low calcium seems problematic on its own. But the study didn't stop there, did it? They started digging into the why. And they looked at blood pressure.
Exactly. They had a hypothesis
Like,
that maybe the link between low calcium and higher mortality could be explained, at least partly, by blood pressure, specifically mean arterial pressure, or MAP.
okay, average artery pressure.
Right. And also how well that blood pressure responds to common ICU medications used to raise it, like norepinephrine.
So the idea is low calcium might mess with blood pressure regulation.
Potentially, yes. It could be a sort of double hit. Maybe low calcium directly leads to lower blood pressure, and it makes it harder for the usual treatments to bring that pressure back up.
Okay, MAP. That makes sense as a vital sign, tells you about perfusion, getting blood to organs. But in the ICU, blood pressure is often all over the place, right? How did they handle that fluctuation?
Good question. They used a measure called TWA-MIPAR, time-weighted average mean arterial pressure.
Time-weighted average.
Yeah, it essentially calculates an average MAP over those first 24 hours, but it gives more weight to pressures that were sustained for longer periods. It smooths out the quick ups and downs.
Ah, okay. A more stable picture of the average pressure.
Exactly. And they looked at this TWA map relative to two different baselines or thresholds, 0 millimeters of mercury and also 65 millimeters of mercury.
Why 65?
That 65 millimeter Hg level is often considered a sort of minimum target in critical care to ensure enough blood flow is getting to the vital organs.
Right, I've heard that number.
Okay.
Okay, so that's average pressure. What about the responsiveness to medication? How'd they measure that?
They came up with a metric they called blood pressure reactivity.
Right.
They calculated it by taking the TWA map, the one above the 0 baseline, and dividing it by the dose of norepinephrine the patient received, adjusted for the patient's weight.
So essentially, how much bang for your buck you get for the norepinephrine? How much the pressure goes up per unit of drug?
That's a great way to think about it, yes. A measure of sensitivity to the drug.
Interesting. Okay, so they have these measures. Average pressure, TWA map, and pressure reactivity, TWA map divided by norepinephrine. What happened when they looked at these in relation to the low calcium and the mortality link?
This is where it gets really interesting. They found that both a lower TWA map and lower blood pressure reactivity.
Meaning less response to the meds.
Correct. Both of these partially mediated the relationship between low ionized calcium and increased mortality.
Mediated. Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
It means these blood pressure factors seem to be part of the pathway or the mechanism through which low calcium leads to worse outcomes. Think of it like a chain reaction. Low calcium, lower BP, worse drug response, higher mortality.
Ah, okay, so the blood pressure issues are like a middle step connecting the calcium to the outcome.
Exactly. The researchers called it a complementary mediation effect. They estimated that the lower average blood pressure explained about 4.5, maybe 4.6% of the link.
Okay, small piece.
And the reduced responsiveness to norepinephrine explained about 2.6%.
So together that's, what, around 7%? It's not the whole story, but it's not nothing either.
Precisely. It suggests that hemodynamic factors, things related to blood flow and pressure, are definitely part of the puzzle, even if they don't explain everything.
Right, it's one piece. Now, did they also find a more direct link Just between calcium levels and blood pressure itself, forgetting mortality for a second.
Yes, they did. The study found a positive correlation,
Meaning?
meaning generally, patients with lower ionized calcium levels tended to have lower TWA maps, lower average blood pressures during that first 24 hours. That held true for both the TWA map above 0 and the one above 65 millimeter Hg.
So lower calcium, lower pressure.
Yeah.
Direct association there.
Yes.
Was this link equally strong for everyone, or did it vary?
Interestingly, it seems strongest in two groups. Patients with severe hypocalcemia, really low levels, and patients who were on lower doses of norepinephrine.
Why might that be? Any ideas?
Well, maybe in patients who are already on high doses of pressure support, the drug effect kind of overwhelms or masks the calcium effect. Whereas at lower doses, or when the calcium is extremely low, that underlying relationship becomes more apparent. That's speculation, though.
Okay, interesting nuance. What about the other blood pressure measure, the reactivity, the response to norepinephrine? Was there a clear link between calcium levels in that?
That relationship was a bit less clear-cut, actually.
Oh.
While their initial look comparing the low calcium group versus the normal group did show some differences in reactivity.
Right.
When they looked for a direct, continuous correlation between the specific IK level and the TWA-MPNA ratio across all patients, the link wasn't as strong or consistent as the link they found between calcium and just the average pressure itself.
Okay, so calcium seems more clearly linked to the overall pressure level than to how well the meds boost that pressure, although both seem to play some mediating role in mortality.
That seems to be what the data suggests, yes.
This paints a really fascinating, complex picture. But, like all research, we need to talk limitations, right?
Yeah.
No study is perfect.
Absolutely essential. And the researchers are upfront about these. Firstly, it's a single-center study.
Meaning all patients were from one hospital system.
Correct. So the findings might not perfectly generalize to ICUs everywhere. Different hospitals can have different patient populations, different standard practices.
Sure, that makes sense. What else?
They only looked at data from the first 24 hours.
Oh, right.
Calcium levels, blood pressure, medication needsies can all change drastically over a longer ICU stay. So we don't know from this study if these relationships persist beyond that first day.
Good point. Anything else major?
They noted they had limited data on magnesium levels. Magnesium is another crucial electrolyte, and it often interacts with calcium metabolism and function. So that's a potential unmeasured factor.
Okay. And the big caveat for this type of study?
The fundamental limitation of any observational study, even a very good one, it can show associations, but it can't prove cause and effect.
Right. Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Exactly. We see that low calcium is linked to lower pressure and higher mortality, and that the pressure partly explains the mortality link. But we can't say definitively from this data that the low calcium caused the lower pressure or the increased risk of death. There could still be other underlying reasons driving all these things that weren't fully captured.
Understood. Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. Let's bring it all together for you, the listener. What's the core message, the main takeaway from digging into this study?
I think the key point is this. We have stronger evidence now that low ionized calcium, right at the beginning of an ICU stay, is linked to a higher chance of dying. And importantly, it seems this increased risk isn't just a random association. It appears to be connected, at least in part, to hemodynamics specifically, lower average blood pressure, and maybe a less effective response to blood pressure medications.
So the aha moment here, perhaps, is seeing this intricate dance between electrolytes like calcium and fundamental physiology like blood pressure control in critical illness. It suggests that maybe paying close attention to calcium and managing it could be more important than previously thought, especially when you're also trying to manage a patient's blood pressure.
Yeah, it elevates the potential significance of monitoring and potentially correcting calcium levels early on, particularly in the context of hemodynamic instability.
Which leads us to that final provocative thought for you to mull over. Given what this study suggests, what are the potential implications for how we care for ICU patients right at the start?
It does make you wonder, doesn't it? Could we perhaps improve outcomes for some patients by being more proactive, maybe more aggressive, with managing calcium levels early on, especially in tandem with blood pressure support strategies?
It's a complex question. There are risks giving calcium too, but this study definitely prompts thinking about that interplay. It highlights just how multifaceted critical illness is.
Absolutely. And how our understanding is always evolving. New research like this constantly refines how we approach patient care.
So this deep dive is really just opening a door. We encourage you to keep an eye out for more research, more discussion in the medical world about this calcium-blood pressure connection.
Definitely. The conversation is ongoing, and studies like this are crucial steps forward.